and the MNCs and the big bosses and the CEOs will still be the one making money out of that, which means overall everyone's economic statuses can improve, but the gap will still exist. We're okay with that gap existing as long as everyone is lifted. So their burden is to tell us, even when our poorer are becoming richer, why do we still have to minimize that gap? Thirdly, people should have the right to define their own quality of life, which goes exactly into our argument of people who have worked hard, of people who want to leave behind a legacy for their children, people who worked hard so that I can live the security of a house for my children. These people should have the right to not be imposed inheritance taxes and the high taxes that will cripple their ability to leave behind a legacy. I'll take opening.
Yeah, so why is it that the moral comparison you're making for the rich people to hang on to their money have to come at the expense of poor people being able to execute their lifestyle choices?
It's not a trade-off. So long as I tell you, we can have alternative resources to help people start at an equal point. And that cost of putting people on an equal starting point is not that high. You need to build schools in the rural areas. You need to give people free education. You need to ensure that people can get tertiary education or get loans to start their businesses. And all those things are functioning pretty decently in Malaysia, and I'm proud to say that. My argument is this. How you impose the victim identity onto the poor when they might not actually want that identity. Two levels. Firstly, no thank you. You impose the idea, so long as you continue to run the rhetorics that we need to tax the rich to help the poor, you are running the rhetoric that the poor are the victims and the rich are the aggressors. Why? Let's look at the poor people and the relatively poor people, not necessarily the ones that are living under the poverty line and are suffering, because we agree that we want to help those people, right? But there are a lot of people in our society who make certain life choices. So for example, I'm a linguistics student and I study arts. I don't look forward to a fancy life of driving a Mercedes. My definition of happiness is to live in my small little house or to stay at home with my parents, to write my own books. And that is my definition of happiness. When the government tells me we need to tax the rich to help you, to help people like you, it is imposing the identity of a victim onto me. It is telling me that I am the pathetic person in society that needs the help from the rich when I might not want those things. And it is unfair for us to impose that identity blanketly on everyone in society. But also, we think it unfairly paints the idea of the rich as the aggressor. But before I move on, closing.
If the rich as a profit-making community wants to continue to profit, what is their incentive to not financially disenfranchise the rest of society to further consolidate their riches?
The primary source of their income is the poor and the middle class, which means the poor and the middle class has to be able to spend, to fly on AirAsia, to fly on Malaysia Airlines, to spend on petrol like Shell, and that is the incentive for CEOs to help the rich, right? Because those are the market that they are tapping in. If everyone is poor, hell, they will leave this country because there's no money to be made. And that is the incentive, because where you make your money is where you have to make the people rich. Secondly, how you paint the rich as aggressors and why that is inherently unfair. Luke talked to you about how the rich came to be at the place that they are, right? They worked, they wanted to leave behind a legacy. They worked hard, and in the birth lottery or the inequality in this nation is not so high that you don't have to do anything at all to be rich. Maybe to a few select politicians, but not all of us. But let's look at the problem. When the government continues, and this is the conclusion to my argument, right? What is the conclusion is that when the government continues to run the rhetoric that we need to impose tax on the richest of the rich and help the poor, is that there is really no form of scrutiny or transparency of the people seeing where the money is going, which means you can continuously use the rhetoric as a shield to tax the rich without showing a substantial improvement of life onto the poor. GDP growth is a tangible measure, and that is what we want to fight for. We're very proud to propose.
speech. I'd like to invite the final speaker of the opening half with his speech.
Okay, fine. I used to work in Shell, so the Shell jokes can stop. Now, what's important in this debate is to recognize a few things. But the government currently get from the rich, and we should tax the rich less. The question then becomes is how then will the welfare systems that you currently want to maintain continue maintaining at the rate it's been dishing out welfare to the lower income or the lower 30% at the same rate without substituting that form of inflow in the first place. And we think that's the kind of disproportionality and economic failure on opening government. I'm going to talk about three things. One, when will the cycle of poverty and welfare dependency ever end when you continuously amplify the crutch mentality that these people generally have to go through? Secondly, by reducing the taxes on the rich or deprioritizing the income inequality of people, what is the trickle-down effect of the money you're making and where does it go to if it's not going back to the people? And we don't think that it will. Lastly, why we need to focus on the income, because the ability to innovate and educate people, especially in times when you want to afford commodities due to capital asset pricing, it's far more important for this to happen. Firstly, rebuttals. They told us from the very beginning, the model that they want is we'll chance it, right? We'll focus on economic growth at the expense of the disparity. And if you get a job, it's up to you in terms of what you want to do. There are two problems with this. Getting a job assumes that you can necessarily educate yourself and get the qualifications that you need in order to access those jobs in the first place. You're putting the cart before the horse. The second point to this is what you're willing to stand for are people who generally don't have an option, that continuously are dependent on welfare, even the bottom 40% that are dependent on these things, to never be able to break out of that cycle because you're just allowing them to chance it when you deprioritize them in terms of government efforts. Those are the kinds of immoral standards that we're not willing to stand for, because we think both can go hand in hand. What Deborah failed to do was to tell you that we need to prioritize one over the other, because somehow by increasing the capital expenditure of people, especially the bottom 40%, it doesn't lead to economic growth, and I don't see why. Secondly, they tell us we need to stop taxing the rich so much because it's problematic. My problem with not taxing the rich so much or reducing the kind of taxation policies that you currently have is that you're going to be unable to sustain the kind of welfare systems that are already in place that are catered towards the bottom 40%. And we think that's a fundamental mismanagement of your funds. But lastly, my POI. Why does the moral comparison have to cite the rich in terms of the quality of life that they want to decide from a state's purview, especially if it comes at the expense of people who are dependent on these kinds of government assistance programs like subsidies and basic allowances? Why is there moral comparison of the moral code that you cite for, not just because by luck you got OG, but you've got to provide the principal argumentation of why is it fair for governments to side with the moral compass of rich people in terms of how they want to lead their lives simply because they just make more money. So we think that's harmful. But lastly, when you talk about the victim identity, that's actually counterintuitive to what you're trying to say, because what you want is to continuously make people dependent on these wealth. Don't focus on the income that they're making or how to make it better. First argument, when will the cycle of poverty end? What we think you do is you reinforce the crutch mentalities that people have by not investing in their kinds of incomes for them to be able to make their own decisions and not continuously be dependent on the options that are just available from a state's standpoint. We think the kind of dependencies of the state naturally needs to stop. If you go to the rural areas of Borneo or even in Kedah or Perlis, these people are the nicest people you will ever meet. They are fundamentally well-mannered, but what is the biggest problem that these people have is they don't have the kind of expenditures to access power structures in order to change their lives. Where Dato Idris comes from, it's a place called Barrio. They've built an airport. It's a very nice place. The biggest problem there are access to power structures for these people to be able to get out of those kinds of systems, and you want to deprioritize those people at the expense of people like us how to spend Sundays any better debating about something that will never change anything else. Those are the kinds of comparisons that we're willing to make. Thirdly, there is nothing stopping the government with the opening government's model to continue to sideline people even further the moment your economic prosperity takes off. This is what China does, right? Because China initially promised its people proper rights and proper salvations at the point they have achieved economic growth. But the moment money influx came in, they forgot about it, right? There's always a continuous deprioritization, and what we think will happen is a continuous abuse of the kinds of systems where they will continuously sideline people who can do nothing for your economy. Tell me, the moment your GDP flies above whatever 7, 8, 9, any incentive for you then to focus on the poor when they do nothing for your economy at that point in time. Go.
How do the majority of poor people in Malaysia move out of poverty? Through welfare or through getting a job and business opportunities?
Getting a job and business opportunities is a given, Deborah. You're not asking the right questions. It's about accessing those jobs by having the right qualifications for those jobs. It's your families being able to afford your types of education and afford the kind of businesses that will increase the kind of household assets you have and the household income for you to access those kinds of educations that get you the jobs that you talk about. Secondly, what is the trickle-down effect? When you deprioritize income inequality, what we haven't heard from opening government, we think this is perverse in many different levels, is the trickle-down effect of money that will naturally stop at this point in time, because there is no incentive for governments to ever kind of prioritize these people at the point in which they make money. The moment you stop the influx by taxing the rich or whatever it is governments do to make more money in order to reduce the disparity of income, those kinds of initiatives stop, because we don't know what the substitute for that is. Whether you're raising taxes for everyone, I don't know, but the absence of that puts these people at a worse off state. Lastly, why we should focus on incomes? Because the ability to educate yourself, or the ability for you as an adult to start innovating and contribute to the economy, is dependent on your first mover initiatives for you to get out of that cycle of poverty or get out of that cycle of dependency. Deprioritizing this removes the kind of structures that are currently in place or that will be in place when it comes to the middle lower class areas, geographical areas like in Johor Bahru, Perlis and the like. But the difference is this: the prices of commodities, because there's capital asset pricing that are already naturally in place. When you deprioritize income disparities, commodities are based on market pricing systems, but the income isn't. And that's the kind of purchasing disparities that we are not willing to side with, because these people will never be able to afford things on their own accord, and they continuously have to depend on these kinds of handouts. And that's the kind of welfare systems we're not willing to place on them. The moral comparisons have to be a key differentiator in this debate in terms of why would this side naturally press and side on the rich people in terms of with their money at the expense of the poor having those same rights and those same privileges. Money should not be a factor we're proud to oppose.
And that's speaker for his speech. Now to continue the case on the closing half, I'd like to invite Member of the Government.
Ladies and gentlemen, the debate thus far has focused on this dichotomy between the rich and the poor. And we think that's the wrong focus of today's debate. When we talk about income inequality, it does not necessarily mean that the poor have to be disadvantaged or the rich necessarily have to be disadvantaged to service the other. What we're talking about, well, first let's get something straight. The poorest of the poor has been decreasing steadily in Malaysia year by year since the NEP in the 1970s. So we're talking, the abject poor are a very small part of this debate. What we are talking about income inequality is the gap between the vast majority of citizens in Malaysia, i.e. the middle class, all of you, and the very top 5% of Malaysia. That is the income inequality that we're talking about. And what we're proposing on side closing government is that it is better for the government to focus, therefore, on growing the GDP, on growing economic growth, because the trickle-down effects that opening tried to talk about, but I'll explain a little bit better, will actually reach to the people on the ground in the form of lower prices, and not just for commodities that they want to talk about in the form of oil and natural gas, although that does translate into lower fuel prices for the citizens, but also in terms of everyday goods and services that people use on an everyday basis. That is how we benefit the people, by working our way from the top. A couple of rebuttals that don't necessarily fit into our analysis. First, they wanted to say that we need to increase the purchasing power of consumers. And we actually agree with that. But we think the best way to do that is not through like government expenditures specifically focused on like middle class and poor people exclusively. But we think the best way is to have that money coming through from the top. While we're on this subject, let's talk about welfare. Welfare is not going to disappear under our model. BRIM will still exist, don't worry about that. University education too is still going to exist because it's not mutually exclusive. Because we see that education, like making sure that our citizens are educated, mutually benefits both sides. It's not mutually exclusive because it will affect income inequality when people are able to like afford to go to university, and also economic growth when they do get jobs and are able to contribute back to the economy. So the education debate here is moot and is not part of this debate because it will exist on both sides regardless. So the debate also is not about like decreasing welfare or decreasing benefits towards those people as well. And we don't necessarily think that that will be affected. You have a question?
I have a question. How is it can you prioritize economic growth that requires public increasing expenditure without increasing household assets?
Well, here's the thing. You want to lessen government spending, but you're fully in line with the government spending far more money on increasing BRIM, on increasing welfare benefits, not just to the bottom poverty, but you want to increase that now also to even middle class people as well, because you want to, that's the only way for you to actually decrease income inequality on your side. So you are also in line with increasing government expenditure. The debate is not about which side is spending more, because both sides are going. The debate is about that expenditure and focusing it in the economy. So how do we do that on side closing government? So I told you before, has been almost eliminated completely from Malaysia, where economic growth has actually occurred for the most part, has been in the form of SMEs, small and medium enterprises, in the form of businesses by everyday local Malaysians. They form actually, including like part of the service industry, about 60% of Malaysia's GDP, and that's a number that's actually growing. And we think that level of growth indicates that Malaysia needs to spend more on those things. And the trade-off here is this: because Malaysia is we're proposing that the government spend more on these type of expenditures, loans to small businesses. That means those are like free, like BRIM and those kind of expenditures that they want on their side will not necessarily happen. Like the expenditure of welfare and those type of programs will not necessarily happen. But we think that's a trade-off we're willing to make. So income inequality has already been consistently reducing year by year as well, because the Gini coefficient has been improved in the years since the 97 financial crisis, coinciding with the government's increase in expenditure at the same time. So how do we actually tackle this? How does the trickle-down effect actually work? By focusing on industries that are profitable and not only giving out loans to people who like are in need, we think that the government, like the country as a whole, will make more profit. How does this work? So we're going to prioritize loans for businesses that show past or future potential profit-making ability, irrespective of your current income or current economic status. What does this mean? It means that we're not necessarily going to be prioritizing industries now that are making a loss. So for example, agricultural sectors, for example, that aren't necessarily making profit, but we keep them alive and afloat through FELDA and other schemes, for example, merely because like we want to like affect income inequality. Those loans necessarily won't be given out anymore. Loans will now be redirected instead to businesses profitable that sell goods and services to the economy. So as these loans, for example, as businesses are able to get cheaper loans that we're prioritizing now in the form of like working capital for businesses to be able to pay off payroll, to be able to purchase raw materials and goods for them to be able to produce in final goods, this will affect their bottom line as well, because this makes it easier for them to pass on those savings onto the consumer as well. So when that happens, the consumer benefits because now they're able to purchase goods and services for a much lower cost than they could have previously, meaning they can like get, for the same amount of money, they get a lot more good. The definition of purchasing power increase. And we think this is something that's beneficial on our side, because this analysis applies equally to rich businesses and middle-class businesses in the areas where there is the most growth. Yes.
So this makes no economic sense. You got to provide the principal application of trade-offs. If you want to focus on businesses that are generally profitable, why does it have to come at the expense of also focusing on economic?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, here's the thing, because when we take away the funding that we necessarily give to non-profitable industries, this is when we're able to redirect our efforts to more profitable industries. So those people are not necessarily abject poor, because welfare programs still do exist. So if they happen to like lose their job because of that, the welfare program will necessarily catch them. We don't think there's anything wrong with that. In fact, the programs that we already do have, for example, for retraining, for refocusing people's efforts, like in the case of like factory workers that need to like retrain in order to go back into the industry, those programs already necessarily exist, and though they will continue to be funded. However, the additional expenditures that you want on your side will go to necessarily unproductive services, and in the long run, Malaysia's economy will not be benefited in the long run. Additionally, the middle class, the overall like majority of consumers within the nations, are the ones that we're trying to benefit the most. They benefit clearly far more on our side when they increase their purchasing power with when lower prices are able to be passed down, because the government has focused like lower and cheaper subsidized loans towards these type of businesses and small medium enterprises that are the backbone of Malaysia's economic growth and progress within this century. We are very proud to propose.
I thank that speaker for his speech. Now I'd like to invite member of opposition to come up to stage.
Testing. Okay. I'd first like to congratulate my 14-year-old teammate Ryan and my 15-year-old student Luke for both reaching their first nationals IB at that age. I could never envision being this good at your age. I'm extremely proud of the both of you, and you deserve all of this and more. All right, closing opposition. We will be the first bench to speak of Vision 2020, because this debate is about what are the explicit goals of the Malaysian government and which policy goal is a more definitive element of Vision 2020 in the binary of choice. This debate cannot happen if we continue to argue that we want to have our cake and eat it too. If we have to choose either or, whether we prioritize economic growth or we prioritize reducing income inequality, we believe as the Malaysian government who wants to reach Vision 2020 prioritize reduction of income inequality. That's our first extension. Second extension, we're going to say in that binary of choice, the government must choose on the side that is defined by their social mandate at all times. Before that, a few rebuttals. First rebuttal, the question is, can we protect the rich without victimizing the poor? That was the premise of opening government. We don't think so. Because your financial security means you are the employers and you decide the financial structure your employees work under. The higher the wages you give to your employees, the lesser your company profit. The better the working conditions, the better the employment benefits, the more you lose as a rich community. So yes, if we want to give more power to the rich, what they can do is control the financial structure in which you continuously and perpetually disenfranchise the rights of other poorer middle income groups to consolidate your profit. And this is the message that you tell them when you say that it's okay to be as rich as you want and not be concerned, because this is not a privilege, this is your right to consolidate your richness as much as you want. And this is not news, guys. With the leak of email correspondences between Apple, Samsung, and Nokia, United States of America, where they explicitly decided to mark which niche market of technology so that they get to control the market rate of wages for their own employees so that they pay their employees less. All of these things are existing, ensuring that giving a lot more rights to the rich means you do disenfranchise the financial rights of other sectors of society. Second rebuttal, imposing their identity onto the poor. We think the poor are the victims. This is not a matter of defining their identity for them. And they don't have a pride issue. They will happily take welfare and handouts by the government because their livelihoods are being threatened on the ground. They don't have food and they are homeless, Mr. Speaker. Pride is not an issue for them. If anything, they will happily embrace it if it means you will give them more handouts. This is a non-issue to defend. The third response is this, is the argument of OG. We want to protect the privileges of the rich community so that people will want to be rich. We have two responses consequences. Number one, there's a natural incentive for anyone, SMEs included, to want to be rich irrespective of government policies like taxation, because even with high taxation, you still get an exponentially higher profit, which will still give you a net revenue, Mr. Speaker, that directly affects your standard of living, directly affects your purchasing power. All these are tangible benefits that they will personally enjoy. So no, we don't need to not tax them so that people have an incentive to be rich. We all want to be rich. The second response is this. They said it's unfair to rich people because people are rich through hard and effort. We think this is a blatantly untrue statement. Under status quo, the rich become richer not purely by effort, because rich people get better education, they get better networking, they get better corporate opportunities because you get to work in your father's company. You get better corporate leverages because your father's family friend owns Samsung. Mr. Speaker, look at all the massive family units within South Korea. Furthermore than that, you want to add on inheritance. That means they have higher revenue and capital to start businesses without any assistance by the government and without any need of education. You don't have an equal platform. Your rights to the rich victimizes the rights of other people within society. You need to start defending victimizing the poor as a harm under your model. Lastly, the rebuttal against the extension that came from Hazem. He wanted to boost economic growth by giving more loans and yada, yada, yada. Therefore, increased purchasing power, economy is good. This debate cannot happen when you only argue the benefits of economic growth in a vacuum, because we do agree that giving more loans gets to economic growth, guys. But the motion says you want to prioritize. Therefore, there is an opportunity cost that you need to be concerned with. Therefore, we are having economic growth at the expense of not reducing the income inequality. So here's the comparative. We think your method of giving money is much more less guaranteed and less impactful than our method of giving money. I'll explain this more under our extension on why your economic growth doesn't trickle down to the people. But secondly, your idea of focusing on SME loans is as if there's no other competitors out there. Sure, you can start as small businesses, but people who are rich and own big corporations still have competitive advantage. They're still able to victimize you, and they're still able to monopolize the market. So you're assuming that they can grow beyond to be a real competitor, but there's a cap as to how well they can do because they do not control the market. Rich people do. Before I go on to my extension, yes.
You cannot just argue that you want to help the poor because economic growth helps the poor. Suppose we ensure the basic living standards of the poor, why is inequality in itself something better?
That's exactly what my extension will tell you. We're going to tell you why all the benefits of economic growth does not materialize when you do not focus on the reduction of income inequality, and that's why Vision 2020 is only fulfilled when you reduce income inequality. Vision 2020 means Malaysia must be a developed country and a first world country by the year 2022. Not defined by a stable economy. This is not defined by massive economic growth, because Japan has the highest economic debt in the world. The United States is indebted in the trillions. But why are they still a first world country? Because the development is defined by the social standards of their society. What is the standard of living? What is the quality of living? The fact that your rights are oppressed or not oppressed by your government. So the question, and I'm answering you now, does economic growth actually achieve that? The answer is a resounding no, because economic growth is defined by the fact that there's a large financial transactions and financial revenue, so that people on the ground have more financial income per capita, so they have purchasing power. But when you have income inequality, the revenue is not spread across society. It is only centralized to the 1% of elite. So actually, your spending power does not increase. Your standard of living does not increase. Your purchasing power does not increase. The income gap essentially means that it's as much revenue economic growth that we want, it is only being centralized to a certain portion of people. Therefore, if you prioritize economic growth at the sake of income inequality, we don't get to achieve Vision 2020, Mr. Speaker, because social standards do not increase. Malaysia is structurally unable to become a developed nation when you allow the rich to continue to manipulate the market. They said that the rates of income inequality has decreased in recent years. That's only because Malaysia has other amazing policies like welfare to the poor, which is reducing the amount of impoverished people, but the gap between the rich and the middle income is extremely high. Lastly, we surrender our right to the government in return of basic protections being granted towards us. It was never the social mandate of governments to become economically efficient and superior. Otherwise, countries like Netherlands and Sweden would never become first world country. They're still a first world country because they're a social welfare state who makes decisions based on the social mandate. What social mandate are you discriminating? The right to equality, that is a constitutional right that everyone here is deserving. We cannot determine the outcome of who you are based on which family you're born with, and those are the privileges that you give to the rich community and the discrimination of the poor. Your state is not acting on the basis of social mandate. We abhor any government who prioritizes growth over reduction of income inequality.
open the floor for the good speeches. First up, Kamahlendra.
First and foremost, I'd like to dedicate this speech to Ulya because I already made this sort of promise. If I go to the finals, then I'll give this speech to you. So it's for you, man. Right. So, going to the first idea of what we're trying to fight for. They're trying to contend on our whole idea whether it's not feasible to even begin with. Like, I'll show you how even in Malaysia right now, it's currently happening, where the TERAS program is introduced, where it's used to help high performance companies to better their expenditures and whatnot by increasing and giving them funds out of 1.64 billions in accordance to cater to 231 companies. And this is a particular race that we're taking because we believe that high performance companies would better on create this sort of economic growth even better, and we're not believing in the idea where there is sort of reduction of income inequality is such a big deal to begin with. But before that, let me explain to you what's really ties burden. We're not the extremely poor or the poor class. It's not really our burden to protect because we believe in the idea where welfare is already sufficient and welfare is still being catered and not being removed under their exaggeration of that particular problem. We still have welfare and we still cater to the poor income. How Hazem portrayed it, which they fail to engage with, is particularly that the majority now that is existing in this income inequality is particularly of the middle class and start exaggerating on the idea that this poor is going to suffer. We don't believe on that particular idea, and they fail to show to us how this middle class income can't focus and can't have this purchasing power, because we believe on the idea it's particularly problematic because you can't have this purchasing power. This sort of burden is so bad that we can't particularly cater. This inequality can't be broken down if you just focus on the poor and not the middle class income, and that's why we're not going to reduce the income inequality. Let's just focus on economic growth towards the betterment of this middle income to create jobs later on. Before I go further, yes, opening.
So you're telling you want to focus on businesses that give you the best amount of profit. That means over time, the focus of governments will only be on businesses that yield the most amount of profit over these kinds of things. How do you then reduce the disparity of income inequality when there's less diversification of businesses?
Well, when we have this business, high performance companies having this sort of funds being given to them, and they create more jobs later on because they have more resources and more businesses to be progressed. That's particularly how you create jobs, reduce inequality, income inequality in the first place. Our side is not fighting against income inequality. We believe income inequality will come, but at the moment now, we believe economic growth is the way to get towards the reduction of income inequality to begin with. Like how Hazem perfectly portrayed to you the trickle-down effect on how these high-performance companies has funded and passed towards consumer prices. This is going to be better, how the trickle-down effect happens. Because particularly when you fund these companies they will then now produce not just jobs, but then again they're going to produce much more cheaper products. It will benefit particularly people on the ground. It's how the trickle-down effect works, and this is particularly even beneficial not just towards the middle-class income, but also on the side of the poor people that are trying to fight for, which we don't see how you're spreading welfare under status quo, and under our side it's already happening. We don't see how it's very material coming up from mine. So let's go with the clashes on how Mai told us that this this sort of money, these funds will be mismanaged by huge companies. We don't believe mismanagement of funds is going to happen because we already have a check and balance system. Take Foxconn in China as an example, where people have been doing demonstrations in particular of their mismanagement of funds to begin with. So that's why in particular, if offers giving this sort of check and balance already exists in combating this sort of idea of mismanagement, that's not going to happen to begin with. And these poor victims that she's trying to fight for, we particularly think welfare is enough, and let's put it there. It's not our burden to cater to the poor because it's already being catered under status quo. So on the idea how the rich people are like to stay at the top because of this sort of networking, like sure, but this sort of networking only happens in a very small amount, and it's still going to happen anyway. And we don't see anything combating under your paradigm of you reducing the sort of income inequality to begin with. So particularly, that's not particularly the whole debate of having this sort of, you know, like the people being up there or having children which is connected to Samsung or whatnot. We don't think it's going to be material. And also on the idea of inequality, sit down. They exaggerated on the idea of inequality. Our side is not going to have this bigger gap later on. Our model is particularly we're going to bring the rich further so that we can bring along the poor up to the same level as well. That's particularly it. That's not going to reduce and increase more gap, and we're going to get that's particularly better on our point, rather than you just spreading out welfare and the economy doesn't grow, and the country won't grow even further. That's why I particularly think that later on we'll break this sort of inequality together while bringing the rich upper hand and also having this gap. We are okay with having this gap, but particularly on the idea of how we boost up the rich and also the poor at the same rate. That's how you fall in a particular stance. Also on idea of how, let's go with a set of opening, like how this poor can't break out of the cycle. We particularly think we have education is already sufficient, and also like how this education and all, it's not our burden to take, like particularly this education is also that they can't get jobs because they're just poor. No, education is already being distributed enough in status quo so they can actually use this sort of education and get work and get higher status. It's their particular job to even boost them up and climb that social ladder to begin with, and that's not the burden of us doing it, because we're provided sufficient necessities from the government side, and that's particularly how it's important to begin with. So let me clarify a bit of our side and how we win this debate. Okay, on the idea of how this poorest of the poor, even the poor, is not particularly on our burden, because we believe in the idea that education already exists, and also welfare, and also how we're going to increase and grow the GDP. That's particularly the best way to even happen on our debate. To win this debate is particularly who caters more to a better economy and which people are being catered. They want to talk about the poor, that's fine. It's a small portion of it. Our side caters towards the middle income class, which are the majority, which will make up for this reduction of income inequality later on that they're trying to fight for. And that's why we got beyond the debate. On the idea now of how the trickle-down benefits and trickle-down effects has already catered to of how these high-performance companies are going to be funding and giving out benefits towards the people on the ground, not just towards catering cheaper products, but again, better for the people on the ground, both middle income classes and also for the poor people.
Thank you very much. Just a reminder to the audience, please keep your discussions at a minimum as to not disrupt the speakers and the adjudicators. Right, I'd like to invite the final speaker of the debate, opposition leader.
Testing. Here. Testing. Mr. Speaker, we think that in today's debate, side closing opposition is the only side that talk about the trade-off harms. How side governments giving out loans towards the poor people to eventually start up a company is at the expense of poor people, and how giving rights towards rich people is also at the expense of poor people. We don't think the two brilliant extensions given by Mai today was even touched or engaged by the government with in today's debate. Let's look at what side closing government wanted to talk about in today's debate. The only main extension coming from side closing government was the trickle-down effect. How giving out loans at the expense of poor people towards the poor people to start companies to give out more job opportunities so that the poor can actually go up to a much better social class and much more purchasing power, right? Look, Mr. Speaker, Madam Chair, there are two responses. Number one, you are not certain whether that company can actually succeed or fail, because we think that there's really no capacity for the poor to actually create a company itself. Therefore, we think it's much more worse, because when you have these loans given out to them and when the companies eventually fail, that's when the poor people are going to be in a much more bigger debt. That's when you put the poor people in a much more worse condition, because that's when you victimize them even more, because when they're already poor and you put them into a much bigger debt, that's when we think that the social conditions of the poor is going to be much more worse, right? But here's the trickle-down effect, right? We think that's so harmful because that's when the rich has control over the financial conditions of their employees, right? We give you examples such as employers suppressing the wages of their employees. When employers give less employment benefits towards the employees and etc., right? So we think even if there's no social mobility. What does this mean? Meaning the poor will continuously remain poor, the middle class will continuously remain in the middle class. There is no trickle-down effect. But let's look at what the whole side of OG want to talk about, right? They want to talk about how we can protect the rich without victimizing the poor. No, right? Because we think that if they want to fight for an equal platform for both rich and poor to compete in the society today, that's when we think that both classes of people must start at an equal platform also. What does this mean? This means that we cannot have the rich having inheritance of their family businesses. That's when you victimize the poor as a whole, because that's when you have the propaganda telling the poor that no matter how hard you work, because of this guy's father's family business, because of his big family's business, you cannot achieve what this guy has achieved. That's when you further victimize, and that's when you further antagonize the poor as a whole, right? But also, secondly, about how we give a fake identity towards the poor, because giving them welfare and helping by reducing income inequality is actually putting on a fake victim identity on the poor. No, right? There are two responses to this. Number one, Mr. Speaker, we think that the poor are already the victims in status quo. That's why we're giving social welfare to them, right? Number two, if in that case, that's when you're talking about that's when you're also giving a fake identity towards the poor, because under your paradigm, you're also going to provide social welfare for the poor. That's when the state also has actions to keep on protecting the poor also. That's when you give a fake identity that you want to talk about to the poor also. But number three, on the birth lottery, right? We think that there is no equality because now you undermine the poor by having a propaganda saying that no matter how hard you work, you will never become rich. But number two, we think that it's the state responsibility to reduce the victimization and discrimination between the rich towards the poor, right? That's when we talk about how economical growth cannot benefit and cannot materialize when there's income inequality also. I'll talk more about that later. Number three, we think that this inheritance is directly discriminating the poor, because if they wanted to fight for equality also, we think that under their side, there's no equal platform for the rich to start off their businesses on an equal platform also. That's when the rich will continuously become rich and richer. That's when the poor will continuously be antagonized and victimized, and that's when they become poorer. Any one of you?
Okay. So if we do give these loans to people that have profit-making ability, this means the quality of life does increase in the form of higher purchasing power, which is goes in line with Vision 2020. If they get rich along with the rich, why does inequality matter?
Look, Mr. Speaker, there is already need that the companies that they are going to form from these loans are going to succeed in status quo. Meaning, if the companies fail after getting the loans, that's when you put the poor people in a much more bigger debt. That's when their lifestyles are going to get more worse, because they really cannot sustain their own lifestyles. And number two, you want them to repay the debt that they owe from the loan also. This is something that is harmful, that they didn't want to engage about. Let's look at the two brilliant extension I brought to you that the whip completely neglected in his speech, right? Number one, how economical growth does not help Malaysia achieve Vision 2020, but reducing income inequality does. This is something that came out explicitly from side closing opposition only, right? Because let's look at what defines a first world nations such as US and Japan, right? We think that in status quo, the economical growth does not define US and Japan as a first world nation, because we think that in status quo itself, Japan is the country that has the biggest debt worldwide, right? We think what defines a first world nation is high and good social standards, right? We think that can only be achieved through reducing through the reduction of income inequality, right? To achieve 2020, we need to secure the social standards, right? We think economical growth does not achieve 2020. Why? Because on the second level, the nation itself, the nation as a whole itself, cannot enjoy economical growth. Why? Because when there's already inequality there, that's when the rich becomes richer, and that's when the poor becomes poorer. So this economical growth that they wanted to talk about is only represented by the 1% of elites in that country itself. Therefore, the benefits of economical growth does not materialize in the presence of income inequality. This is something that they fail to respond to, right? But number two, in the binary choice itself, the government must choose on the side that is detained by the social mandate at all times. Here's what I talk to you about, right? In the social contract, when we surrender rights towards government, that's when the government has already promised us that we live in a comfortable that we live comfortable on the ground, right? We don't think that having economical growth, you actually provide the comfortability to the poor, because that's when because economical growth is only represented by the 1% of elites itself. Only the latter overlaps social mandate, not economical growth. We think that closing opposition takes today's debate.
Invite all the educators to windows to deliberate.